The pews are emptying. Not gradually, not quietly, but in waves. Every Sunday, another family simply doesn't show up. The parking lots that once overflowed with cars now have spaces to spare. The children's ministry rooms that echoed with laughter sit increasingly silent. And in the heart of the American South, in the very region known as the Bible Belt, something remarkable is happening that's reshaping the spiritual landscape of an entire culture. It's a Tuesday morning in Birmingham, Alabama, and Jennifer Matthews sits in her kitchen, scrolling through her phone. She's searching for something she never thought she'd need to find: a new church. For 23 years, she's attended the same Baptist congregation. She was baptized there. She got married there. She raised her children there. But last Sunday was her last Sunday, and she's not alone. According to a 2023 Pew Research study, the number of Americans who identify as religiously unaffiliated has reached 28%, up from just 16% in 2007. But here's what makes this statistic truly staggering. The South, historically the most religious region in America, is now experiencing the fastest rate of religious disaffiliation in the country. The Southern Baptist Convention, the largest Protestant denomination in America, with over 13 million members, lost more than 2 million members between 2018 and 2022. 2 million people. That's roughly equivalent to the entire population of Houston, Texas, simply walking away. And these aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. These are generational members, families whose roots in these congregations go back decades, sometimes over a century. Jennifer's story begins like so many others. I started noticing it during the pandemic, she tells researchers in a 2023 interview. When the churches closed, we started watching services online. And then we started watching services from other churches. Churches in California, churches in New York. And I realized something. My church back home felt different when I returned. Smaller somehow, not in size, but in perspective. The pandemic didn't create this exodus, but it accelerated it in ways that shocked even the most pessimistic church analysts. In 2020, when churches across America shut their doors, something unexpected happened. People didn't just wait patiently to return. They began asking questions, hard questions, questions that had been percolating beneath the surface for years. Welcome to Professor Archive, where we dig deep into the stories that shape our world. And before we continue with this remarkable story, if you appreciate the research and time that goes into these documentaries, please consider leaving a super thanks. It genuinely helps us continue bringing you these in-depth explorations. Now, I'm curious, where in the world are you watching this from, and what time is it there? Drop a comment. I read every single one. Let's go back to understand how we got here. The American South and evangelical Christianity have been intertwined since the First Great Awakening in the 1730s. By the 20th century, the Bible Belt wasn't just a nickname, it was a cultural reality. In states like Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas, and Tennessee, church attendance rates consistently hovered above 50% well into the 2000s. Going to church wasn't just a religious activity, it was a social necessity, a community identifier, a rite of passage. You went to church on Sunday the same way you celebrated the 4th of July or Thanksgiving. But underneath this seeming stability, fault lines were forming. The first major crack appeared in the data around 2012. Sociologists noticed something peculiar. The number of young people in Southern churches was declining at a rate that didn't match general population trends. Dr. Ryan Burge, a political scientist at Eastern Illinois University and a Baptist pastor himself, began tracking this phenomenon. What he found was startling. In 1972, nearly 50% of people aged 18 to 29 in the South attended church regularly. By 2021, that number had dropped to just 28%. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. The people leaving weren't primarily becoming atheists or agnostics. Instead, they were entering what researchers call the nones, people who mark none when asked about religious affiliation. And critically, many of these nones still believed in God. They still prayed. They still considered themselves spiritual. They just didn't want to be part of a church anymore. Marcus Webb grew up in a Pentecostal church in Jackson, Mississippi. His grandfather was a deacon. His mother led the choir. By age 16, Marcus was teaching Sunday school. By 25, he hadn't attended church in 3 years. People always ask me what happened, like I had some big crisis of faith, Marcus explains in a 2022 podcast interview. But that's not what it was. I didn't stop believing in God. I stopped believing in the institution that claimed to represent him. This sentiment echoes across thousands of exit interviews, surveys, and testimonials. The Barna Group, a research organization focused on faith and culture, conducted extensive interviews with church leaders in 2021 and 2022. The findings were illuminating. Only 12% of those who left cited loss of faith as their primary reason. The majority cited issues with the church itself: hypocrisy, political entanglement, judgmental attitudes, irrelevance, and abuse scandals. The political dimension deserves particular attention because it represents one of the most significant factors in this exodus. For decades, evangelical churches in the South maintained a complex relationship with politics. While they certainly had political leanings, there was generally an understanding that the pulpit was sacred space, somewhat separated from partisan politics. That changed dramatically in the 2016 election cycle. According to exit polls analyzed by the Public Religion Research Institute, 81% of white evangelical voters in the South supported Donald Trump in 2016. This wasn't particularly surprising given historical voting patterns. What was surprising was what happened next. Many churches became explicitly political spaces. Pastors who had previously avoided endorsing candidates began doing so openly. Church parking lots hosted voter registration drives for specific parties. Sermons increasingly incorporated political talking points. For some congregants, this was welcome. They felt their values were under attack and appreciated their churches taking a stand. But for others, particularly younger members and those who held different political views, it felt like a betrayal. Sarah Chen, a 34-year-old nurse from Atlanta who grew up Southern Baptist, describes her breaking point. The Sunday after the 2020 election, our pastor spent 45 minutes of his sermon talking about election fraud. He didn't cite sources. He didn't present evidence. He just stated it as fact. And I looked around the sanctuary and everyone was nodding. These were people I loved, people I respected. But in that moment, I realized I couldn't separate the faith from the politics anymore. They had become the same thing. A 2022 survey by the Survey Center on American Life found that 23% of Americans who left religious congregations cited the church's political stances as a major factor. In the South, that number jumped to 29%. But politics, while significant, tells only part of the story. The abuse scandals that have rocked American Christianity have had a particularly devastating impact on Southern churches. In 2019, the Houston Chronicle and San Antonio Express News published a bombshell investigation revealing that more than 700 victims had been abused by Southern Baptist church leaders and volunteers over the previous 20 years. In 2022, an independent investigation commissioned by the Southern Baptist Convention revealed that denominational leaders had maintained a secret list of accused abusers but failed to take action to protect congregations. These revelations shattered trust in ways that go beyond statistics. For many churchgoers, their congregation was supposed to be the safest place they knew. The revelation that leaders had systematically covered up abuse, that they had prioritized protecting the institution over protecting the vulnerable, created a crisis of confidence that's still reverberating. Emily Rodriguez attended a Southern Baptist church in Louisville, Kentucky, for 15 years. She served in children's ministry. When the abuse reports became public, she requested a meeting with church leadership to discuss what safeguards their church had in place. They basically told me I was being paranoid and that I needed to have more faith, Emily recounts. I walked out of that meeting and never went back. Not because I stopped believing in God, but because I couldn't trust these men to lead me to Him. The issue of women in leadership has also emerged as a significant factor, particularly for younger churchgoers. The Southern Baptist Convention has been explicit in its stance that women cannot serve as pastors. Many other evangelical denominations maintain similar restrictions. For previous generations, this was simply accepted as biblical doctrine. But younger people who have grown up seeing women as CEOs, senators, doctors, and military leaders increasingly question why the church should be different. Rachel Morrison grew up in a Presbyterian church in Nashville. She felt called to ministry at age 14. She went to seminary, graduated with honors, and was ready to serve. My church told me I could teach children, I could lead women's Bible studies, I could go on mission trips, Rachel says. But I couldn't preach, I couldn't lead. And when I asked why, the answer was always the same: because you're a woman. That's when I realized I had to choose between my calling and my denomination. I chose my calling. I'm now a pastor at a non-denominational church where gender doesn't determine your ability to serve God. The numbers support Rachel's experience. According to Hartford Seminary's 2020 study, non-denominational churches with egalitarian leadership structures are the only Christian tradition showing significant growth in the South. Meanwhile, denominations that restrict women's leadership roles have seen the steepest declines, particularly among people under 40. But perhaps the most unexpected factor in this exodus is the internet. For generations, your religious understanding was largely shaped by your local church, your family, and perhaps a few books. If you had questions about theology or doubts about your faith, you discussed them with your pastor or kept them to yourself. The internet changed everything. Now, a teenager in rural Alabama with questions about LGBTQ inclusion in Christianity can watch videos from progressive theologians. A young adult in Mississippi wondering about biblical interpretation can access online courses from Yale and Harvard Divinity School. People can attend virtual churches thousands of miles away, exposing them to different traditions, different perspectives, different ways of following Jesus. This democratization of religious knowledge has been revolutionary. Dr. Elizabeth Drescher, who studies digital religion, notes that the internet hasn't made people less religious, but it has made them less likely to accept their local church's interpretation as the only valid one. When you realize there are millions of Christians who interpret Scripture differently, who worship differently, who organize their faith communities differently, it becomes much harder to accept because my pastor said so. As a sufficient answer, Drescher explains, the pandemic accelerated this trend exponentially. When churches moved online during lockdowns, people suddenly had access to services from everywhere, and many liked what they found better than what they had at home. A 2021 Barna study found that 32% of practicing Christians attended online services from churches other than their home congregation during the pandemic. Of those, 58% continued exploring other churches after restrictions lifted. Thomas Bradley, a former deacon at a Southern Baptist church in Oklahoma, describes his experience. During COVID, my wife and I started watching this church out of California. They talked about the same Jesus, read the same Bible, but their whole approach was different. More grace, less judgment, more questions, fewer certainties. When our church reopened, we tried going back, but it felt different. We realized we'd outgrown it. So we left. We still watch that California church every Sunday from our living room. This brings us to a crucial point. Where are these people going? The assumption has often been that people leaving churches are abandoning faith entirely. But the data tells a more complex story. Yes, some are becoming secular. The percentage of religiously unaffiliated Americans has indeed grown significantly. But many church leavers are finding alternative expressions of faith. House churches, small groups that meet in homes rather than traditional buildings, have seen explosive growth across the South. These gatherings typically involve 15 to 30 people, often featuring discussion-based Bible studies rather than traditional sermons. They're usually led by lay people rather than ordained clergy, and they're flourishing. The House Church Network estimates there are now over 6 million Americans participating in house churches, a number that's grown by over 300% since 2010. Non-denominational churches have also become magnets for refugees from traditional denominations. These churches often describe themselves as just Christians, without affiliation to any larger body. They tend to be more flexible in their theology, more contemporary in their worship style, and more focused on practical application than doctrinal precision. According to the Hartford Institute for Religion Research, non-denominational churches now represent the third largest Christian tradition in America, and they're the only tradition showing consistent growth in the South. Then there are the spiritual but not religious folks who maintain personal faith practices without any institutional affiliation. They pray, they read scripture or spiritual texts, they meditate, they might attend church occasionally or watch services online, but they don't consider themselves members of any congregation. Pew Research estimates this group now represents about 11% of Americans, up from 7% just a decade ago. The economic implications of this exodus are staggering. Churches in the South have historically been sustained by a model of broad, consistent giving from members. When the Southern Baptist Convention reported losing 2 million members, it also reported a corresponding decline in total giving of over $500 million between 2018 and 2022. Churches that once supported large staffs and multiple programs have been forced to downsize. Some have merged with other congregations. Others have closed entirely. In rural areas, the impact is particularly acute. Small-town churches that served as community anchors for generations are struggling to keep their doors open. A 2023 study by the Rural Church Network found that 35% of rural Southern churches expect to close within the next decade due to declining attendance and financial unsustainability. These closures don't just affect church members, they impact entire communities that relied on these institutions for social services, community gathering spaces, and cultural continuity. But here's where the story takes another unexpected turn. Some churches are responding to this crisis not by doubling down on traditional approaches, but by fundamentally reimagining what church can be. These congregations are experimenting with new models, new structures, new ways of being community. Take the Table Church in Columbus, Georgia. This congregation meets in a warehouse. There are no pews, no pulpit, no traditional sanctuary. Instead, there are literally tables where people gather in small groups for discussion-based worship. The pastor, Reverend Michael Torres, describes their approach. We realized that people weren't leaving because they didn't want community or didn't want to worship God. They were leaving because the traditional model wasn't working for them anymore. So we asked, what if we built something different? What if church looked more like Acts chapter 2 than the megachurches we've built? The Table Church has grown from 30 people in 2019 to over 400 in 2024, primarily by attracting people who had left traditional churches. They practice radical inclusion, welcoming LGBTQ individuals into full participation. They operate with shared leadership between men and women. They integrate social justice work into their core mission. And they're transparent about finances, making all budgets publicly available. Similarly, Vintage Church in New Orleans has reimagined the entire structure of church leadership. Instead of a single senior pastor, they operate with a team of co-pastors, including women, people of color, and younger leaders. Decision-making happens through consensus rather than hierarchy. Members aren't asked to tithe 10% of their income. Instead, they're invited to participate in communal discernment about how the church's collective resources should be used. These experimental churches remain a minority, but they're attracting attention and growing. They represent a potential future for Southern Christianity that's different from both the traditional model that's hemorrhaging members and complete secularization. The generational dynamics of this exodus deserve closer examination because they reveal that this isn't just a momentary trend, but likely a permanent shift. Baby boomers, those born between 1946 and 1964, remain the most religiously active generation in the South. According to Pew Research, 64% of Southern boomers attend church at least monthly. Among Generation X, born between 1965 and 1980, that number drops to 48%. For millennials, born between 1981 and 1996, it plummets to 31%. And early data on Generation Z suggests even lower rates. What's particularly significant is that these aren't temporary declines that correct as people age. Previous research suggested that people became more religious as they got older, married, and had children. But that pattern appears to be breaking down. Millennials who are now in their 30s and 40s who have children of their own aren't returning to church at the rates their parents did. This suggests we're seeing not just a generational blip, but a fundamental cultural shift. The reasons for generational differences are complex, but certain patterns emerge. Younger generations place higher value on authenticity and are less willing to compartmentalize perceived hypocrisy. They're more likely to prioritize social justice issues like racial equality and LGBTQ inclusion. They're more comfortable with ambiguity and less insistent on doctrinal certainty. And they've grown up in a more pluralistic environment where religious diversity is normal rather than threatening. David Campbell, a political scientist at the University of Notre Dame who has studied American religion for decades, offers this analysis. What we're seeing is the unraveling of the cultural Christianity that dominated the South for so long. It used to be that being Southern and being Christian were almost synonymous. That's no longer true. Christianity now has to compete in the marketplace of ideas, and many churches aren't prepared for that competition. The racial dimensions of this exodus add yet another layer of complexity. Historically, Southern churches have been deeply segregated. The joke that Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in America originated in the South for good reason. While white evangelical churches are experiencing significant decline, the picture in black churches is more nuanced. Black Protestant churches in the South have also seen membership declines, but at a slower rate than white evangelical churches. According to Pew Research, 57% of black Southerners attended church regularly in 2007. By 2023, that number had declined to 47%. Still a decline, but less precipitous than the drop among white evangelicals. However, the reasons for departure often differ. In interviews with black church leavers, issues of LGBTQ inclusion emerge more prominently, as do generational conflicts over worship style and leadership structure. The black church's historical role as a center of community organizing and civil rights activism has created different expectations and different points of tension than in white evangelical churches. Interestingly, some of the most innovative responses to the church exodus are coming from the black church tradition. Churches like The Gathering Spot in Atlanta and Freedom Church in Charlotte are creating hybrid models that combine traditional black church elements like passionate worship and social justice engagement with contemporary approaches to theology and inclusion. The prosperity gospel phenomenon has also played a role in this exodus that's often overlooked. The idea that God wants believers to be wealthy and that faith can be measured by material success became increasingly prominent in Southern churches from the 1990s onward. Televangelists and megachurch pastors promoted this theology, which resonated with American capitalism and Southern optimism. But when the 2008 financial crisis hit, and then when the economic disruptions of the pandemic followed, many people who had embraced prosperity theology found themselves disillusioned. They had done everything right according to this teaching. They had faith, they gave money to the church, they claimed their blessings, and yet they lost their homes, their jobs, their savings. The theological framework couldn't explain their reality. Candace Williams, a former member of a prosperity gospel church in Houston, describes her experience. I gave thousands of dollars I couldn't afford to give because the pastor said it was seed faith. He said God would multiply it back to me. When I lost my job and couldn't pay my rent, I went to the church for help. They told me I must not have enough faith. That's when I realized the whole thing was a con. The megachurch model itself is facing a reckoning. For decades, bigger was considered better. Churches competed to have the largest sanctuary, the most sophisticated technology, the most diverse programming. Megachurches with thousands of attendees were held up as models of success. But many people who left churches describe feeling lost in these large congregations, unable to form meaningful relationships, unsure how their presence or absence even mattered. The pandemic exposed vulnerabilities in the megachurch model. When in-person gatherings became impossible, these churches discovered that their online presence, while technically sophisticated, couldn't replicate the sense of community that was supposed to be their primary value proposition. Many people who had attended megachurches discovered they didn't miss them once they were watching online, because they realized they'd essentially been watching from a distance even when they attended in person. Some megachurches have responded by trying to create smaller communities within the larger structure, implementing small group ministries and house church networks affiliated with the larger congregation. Others have doubled down on production quality and digital engagement, but the trend is unmistakable. The era of endless megachurch growth appears to be over. The impact on seminary education and pastoral training has been profound. Seminaries across the South are reporting declining enrollment. Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, the flagship seminary of the Southern Baptist Convention, reported a 15% decline in enrollment between 2019 and 2023. Smaller denominational seminaries have been hit even harder, with some closing entirely or merging with other institutions. This creates a troubling feedback loop. As churches decline, fewer people pursue pastoral ministry. As fewer people pursue pastoral ministry, churches struggle to find qualified leaders. As they struggle to find leaders, quality declines, which accelerates the exodus. Some denominational leaders privately express concerns that they're facing an existential crisis within the next generation. Yet amid all this decline and disruption, something else is happening that doesn't fit neatly into narratives of religious collapse. Faith isn't disappearing, it's transforming. People are finding God in new places, forming community in new ways, practicing spirituality outside traditional structures. The question isn't whether religion will survive in the South, it's what forms it will take. Look at the growth of faith-based nonprofits disconnected from specific churches. Organizations focused on poverty relief, racial reconciliation, environmental stewardship, and refugee assistance are attracting volunteers and donors who might have previously channeled that energy through their local congregations. Many of these volunteers are church leavers who still want to live out their faith through service but prefer to do so outside institutional church structures. Consider also the rise of online faith communities that transcend geography entirely. People in Alabama are joining virtual small groups with believers in Oregon and Maine. They're forming relationships, studying together, praying together, all without ever physically gathering. These communities lack the geographical rootedness that characterized Southern Christianity for centuries, but they offer something else. The ability to find your tribe, to connect with people who share your specific theological perspective or your particular questions. The economic model of faith is being reimagined too. The traditional tithing system, where members gave 10% of their income to their local church, which then decided how to allocate those funds, is giving way to more distributed giving. People are choosing to support multiple organizations, causes, and communities, rather than concentrating their giving in one institution. This feels more empowering to many donors, but creates sustainability challenges for traditional churches that relied on predictable, concentrated giving. What does all this mean for the future of Southern Christianity? Several scenarios seem possible. One is continued decline toward European levels of religiosity, where churches persist, but as minority institutions, serving a committed core rather than as default community anchors. Another is stabilization at a lower level, with churches that adapt successfully maintaining viable communities while others close. A third possibility is continued fragmentation, with Christianity in the South becoming increasingly diverse, decentralized, and disconnected from institutional structures. What seems almost certain is that the monolithic Southern Bible Belt Christianity of the mid-20th century isn't coming back. The cultural conditions that sustained it have fundamentally changed. The South is more diverse, more educated, more connected to national and global culture than ever before. The social pressure to attend a church has diminished. The assumed connection between being Southern and being Christian has frayed. For some, this represents a tragedy, the loss of a vital part of Southern identity and culture. For others, it represents liberation, the opportunity to pursue authentic faith free from institutional corruption and cultural Christianity. Most people probably feel some combination of both sadness for what's being lost and hope for what might emerge.